The sea did not want it. All night the channel roared like a living thing, heaving gray water against steel and concrete, as if to pry the pieces apart with bare hands. The wind clawed at floating roadways, sent spray tearing across the decks of ships anchored beyond the horizon, and hammered every bolt the engineers had tightened by lantern light. On that morning, the men who had built a harbor where no harbor should exist were out on the causeways again, hands on ropes, boots slipping, jackets soaked through. A line of tugboats strained against their toes, engines beating a low, stubborn heartbeat beneath the storm. A week earlier, there had been only surf and sand. Now there were breakwaters shaped from sunken giants of concrete, pierheads that rose and fell on iron legs, and narrow silver pathways that unrolled across the waves like veins under skin, carrying trucks, carrying tanks, carrying the future of the invasion. 10,000 engineers had been told it could not be done. They did it anyway. And for a brief, breathless span of days, the sea itself was made to hold still. The plan to retake a continent seemed simple from 1,000 miles away. Assemble an army, cross the water, land on a beach, and keep moving. But armies do not move on willpower alone. They move on fuel, on food, on ammunition measured not in boxes but in mountains. In early 1944, the Allied planners faced a reality that threatened to turn bold arrows on maps into stalled lines in the sand. The northern coast of France had no friendly deep-water port. The major harbors, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Boulogne, were either fortified hardpoints or earmarked for demolition if captured. The Germans had rehearsed the same defensive logic since Dunkirk. If an enemy came, the harbors would be rubble before the first Allied ship's whistle faded. The British remembered what it meant to depend on ports. They had watched a miracle evacuation unfold from Dunkirk because a port damaged, desperate, but still present, could cradle small craft as they shuttled men home. An invasion was a different beast. An invasion did not ask to be saved. It demanded to be fed. How do you feed an army if the plates are destroyed? Someone in a dark paneled room, an admiral, an engineer, a minister, with a cigar, said out loud what had hovered at the edge of imagination for months. If you cannot capture a port, you must bring one with you. It sounded like a riddle at first. Then it sounded like a scandal. Finally, it began to sound like a set of blueprints. To supply the invasion through open surf was madness. To attempt it for a day was bravery. To sustain it for weeks was suicide. Ships needed shelter to unload their cargo with the speed and order the war demanded. That shelter could only come from walls. Walls could only come from something anchored to the seabed. But the beaches at Normandy were shallow, the tides theatrical, the weather unpredictable. The solution would be modular, movable, and enormous. A harbor forged from parts, assembled like a giant's toy where waves met sand. One for the British sector at Arromanches, another for the American sector off Omaha Beach. Each would be a civilization of components, each piece with a code name that sounded friendly enough to slip past a letter sensor. Phoenix for the concrete caissons that would become breakwaters, Bombardon for floating steel breakwaters that absorbed the energy of waves, Whale for the flexible steel roadways, Beetle for the pontoons that bore them, Spud for the pierheads that would rise and fall with the breathing of the sea. No one had built anything like it. No one could promise it would work, and the calendar did not care. In shipyards and river mouths across Britain, the invisible city began to take shape in secret. Concrete, dull, gray, obedient was poured into colossal forms to create the Phoenix caissons. Each one was a hollow building in disguise, a cathedral of wet stone, destined not for the sky, but for the seafloor. They loomed in tidal basins like stranded whales. Children on bicycles came to stare. Workers gave them nicknames and learned to walk their scaffolding in the fog. Farther north, welders stitched whale roadways together with sparks. The roadways were ingenious, a series of floating spans, each able to flex with waves without snapping. They would connect anchored pierheads to moored ships, turning the moving water into a conveyor system that worked with the tide instead of against it. Engineers tested prototypes in secluded locks where the wind carried only secrets. Observers in flat caps and oilskins made notes as model of the winter waves. What anchors could grip sand that shifted like a living thing beneath every swell? The answers were not elegant. They were practical. Double the chains. Overbuild the joints. Accept that the sea takes a tax on all human plans and add margin until the numbers obey. Civic Britain became a wartime production line. A park became a storage yard. A quiet quay sprouted gantries and steel. Night shifts blurred into morning whistles. Cafes near the yards learned to keep open at strange hours because men with chalk under their fingernails needed tea when the rest of the city slept. Not all the logic lived on drawing boards. Some lived inside human bodies that had known waves since childhood. Harbor pilots who could read a tide by scent and color. Tugboat captains who understood the difference between resisting the sea and persuading it. A younger engineer with a slide rule stood beside a master mariner with squint lines, and together they agreed on where a mooring should not go. The code names traveled by courier only. The words Mulberry A and Mulberry B existed in thick folders behind locked doors, where clerks closed the blinds, even when the rain had already done the job. D-Day arrived with smoke and thunder and prayers, and while infantry stormed the beaches and paratroopers marched out of the night sky, a second invasion force began to move. An armada of harbors. To the towns along the Thames and Clyde, it must have seemed as if parts of the country itself had decided to go to sea. Phoenix caissons, some as tall as church towers, were eased into the water. Tugs, their names painted in fat letters and their crews bristling with cigarettes and understatements, took lines and felt the weight settle into their bones. The channel does not give favors in early June. The weather was sullen. Swells shouldered the caissons and dared the tugs to keep their feet. Mines waited in patient grids beneath the gray. A few Luftwaffe sorties still hunted the water for fat targets, and a floating fortress made of concrete would have been a story a pilot could brag about for years. Convoys crept south and east, bleeding speed for safety. Each knot saved might cost a life. Each hour delayed might cost a beachhead. But still they came. From above, they looked like dots and dashes scribbled by a hurried hand across a sheet of steel. From deck level, they felt like a city emigrating, houses without roofs, streets without pavement, all bound for a shoreline where nothing man-made had stood the day before. Day revealed a horizon with ships packed tight as teeth. Signal flags snapped, lamps winked. Men slept where they could and woke with the taste of salt already on their tongues. Somewhere ahead, soldiers fought in hedgerows that smelled of crushed leaves and cordite. Somewhere behind, welders who had built the roadways walked home under dawns stained by factory smoke and listened to the wireless for news that did not mention what they had done. Inch by inch, the pieces arrived. The beaches of Normandy had a sound in those days that is hard to describe now. It was not only guns and engines. It was the organized chaos of logistics, awakening crates hitting surf, shouts turned to gestures because the wind stole words, the metallic complaint of ramps lowered and raised, the groan of vehicles surprised to find themselves in salt water. Into that frantic music came the method of the harbor. The first act was surgery. Phoenix caissons were towed to exact positions by men with binoculars and compasses, who understood that a mistake measured in meters could become a catastrophe measured in lives. Ballast tanks were opened. The concrete giants drank the sea and sank with slow dignity until they kissed the seabed. Each one settled into place like a letter dropped into the correct slot of a code. Together, aligned in columns, they began to break the waves, gathering the energy of the channel and scattering it into harmless slop behind their backs. With the water tamed, the bombarded floating breakwaters were chained into place farther out, their steel cruciform shapes nodding like rough-hewn buoys. Closer to shore, spud pierheads, the heart of the system, were anchored on tall legs planted into the sand. They looked odd, like industrial storks, but when the tide rose, they rose, and when the tide fell, they settled, keeping the unloading platforms level while the world around them breathed up and down. Finally, the whale roadways were brought in sections and pinned together with engineering that forgave the sea its moods. They arched gracefully from ship to pierhead, from pierhead to shallow water, from shallow water to land. A truck could drive from the deck of a freighter, over the moving sea, and plant its tires in France without ever touching surf. All the while, German guns searched for the pattern. A harbor was a promise. Work went on by night under hoods of darkness, by day under curtains of smoke. Men learned to count the seconds between bursts and to measure their movements to the beat of survival. A dropped wrench could be the start of a story retold for decades. A missed connection could be the end of one. Then the storm came. On June 19th, the channel remembered itself and rose with a vengeance gale of a force not seen there in 40 years. The sea bedded its shoulder against the new-built structures and shoved. The effect on the American harbor off Omaha was brutal. Roadways twisted, pierheads wrenched, anchors skipped. The storm did not negotiate. It collected what it was owed. By dawn, Mulberry A was wreckage. At Arromanches, where the British harbor Mulberry B stood, the story was different. Not easy, not gentle, but different. The pattern of caissons lay just so. The set of the seabed gave a slight grace. The lines held. The anchors bit. The gods of tide and probability looked elsewhere. Damage there was, but the harbor lived. The morning after the storm, the engineers did not hold a ceremony for the miracle. They checked bolts. They hauled lines. They replaced sections. They looked from pierhead to horizon with the kind of assessment only people who have built something difficult can make. And then they went back to work. If war is a succession of problems, logistics is the art of solving them faster than they arrive. With Mulberry B operating, problems began to shrink. Ships that once loitered offshore, gambling with weather and enemy attention while small craft tried to ferry their cargo ashore, now took numbers like men waiting for a barbershop chair. They moved alongside the pierheads. Ramps clanged. The first trucks rumbled forward onto the whale roadways, their frames flexing as steel spanned water. Men peered over their doors at gray waves snuffling at the beetle pontoons, and could not quite believe that they were driving on the sea. The harbor became a rhythm. A convoy arrived with ammunition and tinned meat and tires and oil and tent canvas and boots and radio spares and 100 other things without heroic reputations that keep armies alive. The harbor swallowed it, organized it, and pushed it inland. Then another convoy arrived, then another. The numbers, when read on a page, sound like exaggeration. Those numbers exist because of smaller ones. How many minutes a truck lingered at the top of a ramp before finding its gear. How many seconds a winch operator took to slack a line when a swell tried to make his load a pendulum. How many degrees an officer let the tide turn before ordering a section of roadway to be realigned. Inland, soldiers noticed. Not the harbor itself, most never saw it, but the feeling that the machine behind them was learning to breathe deeper. A tank unit fighting a day too long on tracks that should have been replaced found new tracks waiting at a crossroads. An infantry company that had gone light on ammunition to make time found crates stacked like steps when they bivouacked in an orchard. The miracle of Mulberry did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived like punctuality. The harbor also taught lessons faster than textbooks could. Engineers discovered which joints tolerated a particular twist of tide and which did not. They learned the voice of a failing anchor hours before the failure. They learned that you respect the sea by giving it a way to move, and you respect men by making sure the bolt they need is at hand when the light is bad. When the weather turned again, as it always does, the harbor flexed and endured. Some nights, under hooded lamps, the men who had built this moving anatomy could sense the whole structure breathing under their boots, a faint transmission of motion through steel and water. Proof that the plan to work with the sea was wiser than any attempt to tame it. Across the channel, at shipyards and piers where the Mulberry A components had been forged, word trickled back about the loss off Omaha. Grief mixed with stubbornness. The harbor that died in the storm had bought time. The harbor that lived would spend it well. Ask the men who built it what they remember, and many start with small things. The way a rope tastes when it's been in salt water for days. The smell of hot steel and diesel in the same breath. The weight of a sledge after the 20th swing. The sudden silence when a gust dies and the sound of your own breath arrives as news. One remembers learning to judge the mood of the day by the tone of the waves against the caissons, whether they came in slaps, in smacks, or in a long, low, rubbing moan. Another remembers the first truck that drove ashore with a crate of letters, thin blue paper folded around handwriting that could stop a man where he stood. There were jokes. There were accidents and there was grief. The kind that does not need a narrator. A slipped line. A misread signal. A moment when a machine does what machines do, and a human body cannot afford the lesson. Names passed back to England. Quiet funerals with words spoken in the rhythm of tide tables. And then, because the war did not ask for permission, the work continued. For the planners, for the generals, the harbor was a line item in a brief, a logistical arrow that thickened from summer into autumn, and then began to thin as Allied forces seized real ports, Cherbourg, Antwerp, others whose moles and warehouses could do the work more naturally. For the engineers, the harbor remained a living thing, a patient that had survived an operation that experts found too risky to attempt. If you ask them whether it was the greatest project they ever worked on, they sometimes look confused by the scale of the question. It was a job. It was the job. It was what stood between men and failure. And it worked. Victory likes monuments. It prefers arches and statues and buildings with plaques. Mulberry's monuments were always destined to rust. As ports fell to Allied control and the overland supply web tightened, the artificial harbor's traffic eased. Some sections were dismantled and towed away, their steel recycled into other work. Some Phoenix caissons were scuttled to serve as breakwaters elsewhere. Some pieces were simply left where they were, to be taken apart by the tide with the patient thoroughness of nature. In the years after the war, children on holiday at Arromanches-les-Bains would kick through the surf and see shapes at low tide that did not belong to a beach rust-hatched ribs, concrete cubes furred with seaweed, iron fittings dappled by barnacles. Locals gave directions that included phrases like, "past the old port," meaning a place that had lived only a season and a half and then drifted into legend. History books put Mulberry where such feats often go, in a chapter between the churning drama of the landings and the sober advance inland. Specialists remembered. Of course, engineers, logisticians, the keepers of the particular flame that burns for the people who build the stage before the actors step on it. But the general imagination found it easier to remember the storming of a beach than the raising of a harbor. That is understandable. It is also a small injustice. Courage and enough math to the meeting. It means that sometimes the road to victory is made of bolts and ballast, not only of bullets. It also means that ideas must be practical to be brave. The Mulberry Harbors were not miracles conjured from fog. They were the sum of thousands of choices made by people who respected the sea enough to compromise with it. The men who named the parts Phoenix, Whale, Beetle, Spud did not do it to be cute. They did it because the things they were making were alive enough to earn names. In a war remembered for grand strategies and terrible costs, for crimes and courage too large to fit inside any sentence, the harbors at Normandy were a reminder that human beings can create solutions that feel like magic because they are made from discipline. And there is a quieter meaning, that work done without applause matters. The soldier who never saw the harbor but felt it in the steady arrival of supplies was carried forward by hands he would never shake. The welder who went home with the taste of metal at the back of his throat. The tug captain who found a gap in a gale. The surveyor who set out a line knowing a wrong angle would waste a day the army could not spare. These people composed a choir without melody, a score without violins, that still managed to be music. Go to the coast of Normandy when the tide is low. Walk past the cafes and the postcards, past the steps where children hold cones of melting ice cream and stare into the surf. Keep walking until the wet sand turns to a mirror, and your shoes print themselves in dark ovals that fill with water. Out there, the sea's skin is interrupted by shapes that make no sense unless someone tells you. Concrete, iron, geometry. The outline of a thing that once defied erasure. Put your hand on it, and you will feel not the past but the present. The same chill, the same salt, the same insistence of water against what we build. And you might hear, if you let the wind carry it, the echo of engines, and the voices of men calling to each other in a language older than speech. The language of effort shared with purpose. They built a harbor where there was none. They built it to last a week, and it lasted long enough to change the war. When the tide goes out, what remains is not only rusted steel and weathered concrete. What remains is the proof that courage can be engineered, bolt by bolt, tide by tide, until the impossible finally stands.